These three disturbing Appalachian Mountains horror stories about folklore horror are inspired by real events. First, a hiker follows a woman's agonizing scream into the woods, only to be trapped by a six-clawed nightmare that marks him as property. Next, three cavers descend into the crushing dark, waking up a colony of pale, wet monsters that mimic their voices to lure them deeper. And finally, a surveyor realizes he is being hunted by something that can rewrite his maps just to keep him in the forest. You need to watch until the very end, because nothing creates pure dread like the moment a massive buck stands up on its hind legs and starts whispering to the trail camera. The difference between a tourist and a survivor is often just one thing: listening. Most seek the woods for peace, for silence. But sometimes, the silence is waiting. Curtis wasn't a green hiker. He had calloused hands and knew the difference between a shifting stone and a snapped branch. He knew the woods. That confidence was the only reason he hadn't turned around at the ranger station that morning. It was autumn in the Cataloochee Valley, a deep, isolated stretch of the Great Smoky Mountains. The ranger, a man with a face like worn leather, didn't smile as Curtis signed the permits. "You're camping near the old Cherokee place," the ranger stated, not looking up. "It is beautiful country, but listen to me. If you hear a woman screaming out there, you do not go looking for her." Curtis paused, pen hovering. "You lock your tent," the ranger continued, his voice flat. "And you wait. There are things in that valley older than this park, and she is hunting." Curtis had nodded, dismissing it as a spooky story for tourists. He finished signing, grabbed his pack, and walked out into the cool mountain air. He didn't know it yet, but he had just made his first mistake. The hike was perfect, the air carrying the sharp scent of pine and wet earth. But by the time Curtis reached the skeletal remains of the old homestead, the sun was bleeding out of the sky. The trees here grew too close together, weaving a suffocating canopy that blocked the last of the light. The wind suddenly died, leaving the air stagnant and still. Curtis tried to ignore the shift. He started boiling water, the hiss of the stove the only sound in the darkness. Then the sound started. It came from the deep woods. It wasn't a coyote or a bobcat. It was a woman. A high, panicked shriek tore through the trees. It wasn't just fear, it was agony. It sounded exactly, impossibly, like a woman being murdered just beyond his camp. The sound hit Curtis like a physical blow. Blood rushed to his ears. His heart hammered a frantic drum against his ribs. Do not go looking for her. But Curtis was a man who fixed things. He couldn't leave someone to die because of a ghost story. He strapped on his headlamp, cutting a bright cone through the gloom, drew his hunting knife, and stepped into the black. The underbrush was thick, grabbing at his legs like grasping hands. He moved toward the flooded part of the valley where the mud sucked at his boots. The screaming was closer now, louder, almost shattering. He burst into a small, muddy clearing, knife raised, light sweeping the area. And then the screaming stopped. It didn't fade, it cut off instantly. The void that replaced the noise was physical, a vacuum that made his ears pop. Curtis stood frozen, the steam of his breath dancing in the beam. He scanned the ground for a victim. He didn't find the woman. He found the tracks. Embedded in the soft mud was a clear set of paw prints. They were massive, larger than any mountain lion. But the size wasn't the problem. The problem was the shape. They were unnatural. Every single track had 6 distinct toe pads. 6 perfectly parallel indentations in the muck. It wasn't a mistake. It was a horrifying pattern repeated dozens of times, leading from the dark woods through the clearing and back into the dark again. The thing that made that sound wasn't human. The truth hit him like ice water. The screaming wasn't a cry for help. It was a lure. He was standing right where the hunting had finished. The forest suddenly felt like a trap, a dark, wet cage closing in. Then he heard it, just beyond the edge of his light circling him. A heavy, wet, ragged breathing, like a large animal struggling for air, but enjoying the struggle. Hush, hush. In, out, pause. In, out. It never got closer, but kept moving. A slow ring of unseen menace. Curtis knew it was waiting for him to run. He whipped his headlamp toward the tree line. For a split second, he saw the yellow, not reflecting, glowing. Two large, flat, yellow eyes at chest height, staring from the shadows. As he swept the light back, he caught the silhouette. Massive, taller than a bear on all fours. Feline, but the body was too long, stretched out like something pulled on a rack. Then it moved. It stepped with its front four legs in a regular walk, but the back two legs were held up, tucked against its body. Violently, those back legs kicked out, launching the thing forward in an unnatural burst. Four legs walking, two legs leaping. It was built wrong on purpose. A biological machine of impossible muscle and wrong geometry. Fear finally cut through Curtis's courage. He exploded backward through the brush, crashing through thorns he didn't even feel. The creature was on his heels instantly. He could hear that terrifying, unnatural gait. Step, 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 step. The sickening rhythm of a walk, followed by a massive two-legged bound. It stayed just outside his light, a bounding shadow keeping pace with his frantic sprint. It was playing with him. Curtis burst into his camp, slammed into his tent, and ripped the zippers down. He threw himself inside, yanking the zipper shut with shaking hands. He held his knife against the thin nylon shell, a toy against something with that much power. The pursuit stopped at the perimeter. The heavy bounding footsteps ceased. The air went still again, but this time it was a taut, unbearable stillness. The thing was right outside. Curtis could feel its presence, the sheer size displacing the air. He was a passive observer of his own fate, his heart beating so hard he couldn't hear his own shallow breaths. Then the circling started. The beast began walking, slowly, methodically, around the tent. The crunch of pine needles under massive paws sounded like gunshots, and then it touched the tent. It started to drag its claws. It was a terrifying, high-pitched screech, like heavy, rusty metal being torn from a sheet. The claws dragged deliberately across the nylon, inches above his head. He watched the fabric depress, 3, 4, 5, 6 distinct points pressing down, sliding along the roof, digging into the earth. The creature wasn't trying to get in. If it wanted in, Curtis would be dead. It was leaving a message. It was marking the space. The siege went on for hours, the circling, the breathing, the scratching, a relentless violation. Curtis sat in the center, knife raised, waiting to die. But death didn't come. Dawn did. At the first gray light, the weight lifted. The sounds stopped. The surrounding emptiness felt real this time, cold and vacant. Curtis waited 20 minutes before slowly unzipping the tent. The creature was gone. But the message remained. On the trunk of a massive oak, right where his zipper had faced, the bark was shredded. Deep, freshly gouged marks. 4 long parallel lines, 2 more lines offset below them. A 6-clawed hand. She hadn't been hunting for food. She had been hunting for territory. And she had claimed his camp. Curtis walked out of Cataloochee as fast as he could, head on a swivel. When he found the ranger station, he recounted the story, skipping none of the impossible details. The 6 toes, the hopping gait, the yellow eyes. The old man didn't laugh. His face went pale. He didn't offer a refund. He just looked past Curtis toward the mist-covered mountains and finally gave the horror a name. "You met the Wampus Cat's son," the ranger whispered. "She marked your camp. Don't ever come back to Cataloochee. She remembers faces." And Curtis knew, with a certainty that settled into his bones like the mountain cold, that the blue-collar hiker was gone. Only the hunted remained. There is a specific kind of silence that only exists 400 feet underground. It is not peaceful. It is heavy. It presses against your eardrums and squeezes the air out of your lungs. It is the silence of a place that the world has forgotten, or perhaps a place the world has tried very hard to bury. For Amanda, Harlan, and Levi, that silence was the allure. They weren't thrill-seekers or reckless kids. They were experienced spelunkers, amateurs in title, but professionals in practice. They knew the ropes, they knew the risks, and they knew the Cherokee National Forest in Tennessee better than most. Their target was a potential virgin cave system beneath the roots of Bald Mountain. It was supposed to be a standard expedition, mapping the unmapped, seeing what no human eyes had seen before. They found exactly what they were looking for. And then, they found what they weren't. The descent was technical but manageable. As they dropped, the air grew cooler, the humidity rising until their skin felt tacky and damp. By the time they reached the 400-foot mark, the forest floor above them felt like a memory of a different planet. They were in the deep earth now. Harlan was on point, his headlamp cutting a cone of white through the crushing black. The limestone walls here were different. Usually you look for geological formations, stalactites, flowstone. But Harlan's light caught something else. Scratches, deep, deliberate grooves in the rock. He signaled the others to stop. They gathered around the wall, their combined beams illuminating a panel of petroglyphs. But these weren't the familiar geometric shapes or animal figures of the Cherokee or other known indigenous groups. These were jagged, frantic carvings, alien. They depicted shapes that looked like people, but elongated, stretched thin, with exaggerated limbs. It was evidence of presence, of history, but it matched no history book any of them had ever read. A chill that had nothing to do with the cave's temperature settled over the group. They weren't exploring an empty geological feature. They were trespassing. They pushed on, compelled by that dangerous curiosity that drives all explorers. They had to crawl through a final, constricting tunnel to move forward. As they shimmied through the rock, the air quality shifted violently. The smell hit them first. It wasn't just the musk of wet dirt and stale air anymore. It was metallic, sharp. It smelled like copper and rot. It smelled distinctly like an open wound. The tunnel opened up into a massive, cavernous chamber. It was wet, the sound of dripping water echoing like a slow, ticking clock. Their light swept the perimeter, revealing crude structures built directly into the cavern walls. They were dwellings, piles of stone arranged with intent, but they were too small, too irregular. They looked like nests. Harlan moved toward a dark fissure in the far wall, a natural doorway into the deeper dark. That was when he heard it. It was faint at first, a rapid, repetitive whispering. Tsk-tsk-whiss-whiss, high-pitched and frantic. It sounded like a language, but the cadence was wrong, too fast. No breaths between the sounds. Harlan froze, raising a hand. "Lights," he whispered. They cut their headlamps. The absolute dark of the cave rushed in, blinding and suffocating. In the blackness, The sound changed. The whispering was joined by a physical sound. Scrape, scrape, scrape. It was the dry, brittle sound of bone dragging against stone, and it was getting closer. "Lights!" Harlan hissed. "Now!" Amanda angled her high-intensity beam directly into the fissure. The light cut through the gloom and landed on them. 5 figures were huddled against the wet rock wall, perhaps 30 feet away. They were humanoid, but they were not human. They were naked, their skin a translucent, sickly white, like wet linen wrapped around bone. They were emaciated, their limbs too long, their elbows and knees jutting out at sharp, unnatural angles. They were huddled together, facing the wall, shivering. Harlan felt the primal urge to run, a biological alarm screaming in his hindbrain, but they couldn't move. They were paralyzed by the sheer impossibility of what they were seeing. Amanda, perhaps thinking the light would scare them off, pushed her beam to maximum intensity. The cavern went bright white. The silence shattered. The figures didn't scream. They shrieked. It was a sound of pure animalistic rage, high and piercing, clawing at the explorer's eardrums. And then, they moved. They didn't stand up. They dropped instantly to all fours, their limbs splaying out like spiders. They scuttled with a disgusting, blurring speed, vanishing into the side tunnels and cracks in the rock. But in that split second of movement, the light caught their faces. They had no noses, just slits. But their eyes were enormous, round, silvery spheres that took up half their faces, reflecting the flashlight beam like glass. They were eyes evolved for an environment where the sun never shone. Eyes that saw everything in the dark. "Go!" Harlan yelled. "Move! Now!" They turned, scrambling back toward the tunnel they had come from. Chaos took over. The wet rock was slick under their boots. They were breathing hard, the metallic smell of the cave choking them. Then Harlan's world ended. His headlamp flickered once and died. It wasn't just dark, it was a void. He was blind. The sudden sensory deprivation hit him like a physical blow. He stumbled, his hands grasping for the wall, for Levi, for anything. "Levi," he screamed. "Light! I have no—" Before he could finish the sentence, something cold wrapped around his ankle. It was a hand. He knew it was a hand, but the anatomy was all wrong. It was wet and slick with slime. The grip was weak, trembling, but the fingers, there were too many of them. He felt knuckles pressing into his skin where there shouldn't be knuckles. Long, multi-jointed fingers coiled around his boot and skin like wet rope. Panic, absolute and white-hot, detonated in his chest. He didn't think. He kicked. He lashed out backward with his free leg, his boot connecting with something soft and wet that gave way without the resistance of bone or muscle. The grip broke. "Harlan!" Levi's voice was ahead of him. A beam of light swung back, blinding him for a second, but he scrambled toward it, crab-walking backward, his eyes fixed on the darkness he had just escaped. He heard the scraping again. It wasn't one source anymore. It was everywhere. Above them, beside them. The sound of wet skin slapping against rock. They didn't bother with stealth. They scrambled up the incline, bruising their knees and elbows, driven by the terror of being touched. As they retreated, the sounds behind them changed. The shrieking stopped. The scraping stopped. A sound drifted up from the dark. It was giggling. High-pitched, wet, breathless giggling. It sounded like children, but wrong. Malicious. Like a terrible inside joke was being shared in the tunnels below. And then, the voices started. "Wait!" The voice was thin, sharp, and distorted, but the pitch was undeniable. It was mimicking Harlan. "Don't leave us!" That was Levi's voice, twisted and flattened, coming from a throat that wasn't designed for human speech. Here! Here! Wait! They were smart. They weren't just animals defending a den. They were hunting. They were trying to lure them back. The trio scrambled through the final ascent, lungs burning, the daylight appearing as a faint gray circle above. They hauled themselves up the final ledge, gasping, clawing at the moss and dirt of the surface world. They collapsed on the rocks, the sunlight blinding them, the heat of the Tennessee afternoon hitting their cold skin. After a moment, when their breathing slowed, they turned back to the cave mouth. The opening was a black circle, a heavy contrast against the bright green of the forest. And there, just inside the threshold where the sunlight couldn't reach, they were standing. Dozens of them. Packed into the darkness, a wall of pale, translucent bodies. Their massive silvery eyes were fixed on the three explorers. They stood completely still, silent now. The giggling had stopped. The mimicry had stopped. They were just watching. The sun was the only thing holding them back. A barrier of light they couldn't cross. Harlan stared at them, and he felt the phantom sensation of those cold, multi-jointed fingers still lingering on his ankle. He realized then that the folklore wasn't just a story. The locals called them the Moon-Eyed People, a race said to live underground, blinded by the sun, hidden away since before history began. They aren't gone. They aren't a myth. The world isn't empty, and we aren't alone on it. We just live in the light, and they are waiting, very patiently, in the dark. Isaiah lived by numbers. He was a surveyor, a man who made his living turning the overgrown chaos of the Virginia wilderness into neat straight lines on a digital map. He didn't have time for ghost stories or local legends. He respected coordinates. He respected what he could measure with a laser and verify with a GPS satellite. If you couldn't plot it on a grid, it didn't exist. That was the job. You hike out, set up the gear, log the data, and go home. Simple. November on an Appalachian ridge is a miserable kind of cold. It's a wet, heavy air that soaks right through your jacket. Isaiah was working a timber acquisition contract miles from a paved road. It was just him, his truck parked a mile back, and $50,000 of high-end measuring equipment. First light hit the clearing as he set up his total station. He leveled the tripod, booted up the system, and listened to the silence. It wasn't peaceful. It was empty. No birds, no squirrels, just the sound of his boots crunching on the frost. He aimed the laser across the valley to hit his first boundary marker. He looked through the scope to fine-tune the focus. That's when he saw it. 300 yards out, standing dead center on the property line, was a buck. It was massive. 10 points easy, but it wasn't acting right. A deer that size usually bolts the second it catches your scent. This thing was absolutely still. It looked like a taxidermy mount someone had dragged into the woods as a joke. It stood broadside, staring straight ahead. It didn't twitch an ear. It didn't stomp a hoof. It just existed there, like a dark statue dropped into the tall grass. Isaiah watched it for 20 minutes. He checked his watch. The wind picked up, rustling the dead leaves around it. But the animal didn't shift its weight. It was unnatural. A living thing has a rhythm. Ribs moving with breath, muscles tensing. This had none of that. It was just a void in the landscape shaped like a deer. Work had to get done eventually. He shot his laser, got his distance reading, and logged it. He looked back through the scope one last time, and the deer was gone. No sound of it leaving, just empty space. Packing up, he tried to shake the feeling of being watched. It wasn't until lunch, reviewing the data in his truck, that the hair on his arms stood up. 2 shots were taken on that line, 20 minutes apart. The first coordinate and the last didn't match. According to the machine, and the machine didn't lie, that deer had moved exactly 10 feet to the west. Isaiah stared at the screen. He had watched that animal through a magnified lens. He would have bet his paycheck it hadn't moved an inch. But the math said otherwise. He told himself it was a glitch, a sensor error. He tried to force the logic to fit, but his gut was already twisting. Next morning, he decided to cover his bases. He strapped a motion-activated trail camera to a thick oak tree overlooking the main work area. He told himself it was for evidence of wildlife interference. Hiking down into the hollow to mark the corner, the shadows stretched long. He found the old stone pile marking the boundary, set up his tripod, and looked up. His heart hammered against his ribs. It was there. The deer was standing right next to the stone pile. It wasn't grazing. It was facing him, head leveled, waiting. It stood on the exact coordinate Isaiah needed to occupy. It was like the thing had read the blueprints. It knew where the line went. Go on!" Isaiah yelled. His voice sounded flat in the damp air. The deer didn't flinch. It slowly turned its head, the movement rigid and mechanical, and looked him dead in the eye. Its eyes were too wide, too dark. There was no fear. It was like looking into a camera lens. For 3 days, this pattern ate away at his sanity. He would map out his day, picking 3 or 4 spots to survey. Every single time he arrived, the deer was already there. It beat him to the spot by hours. He would check the timestamps later. The thing would arrive at a random patch of woods at 8 a.m., just waiting for Isaiah to show up at 10. It wasn't protecting territory. It was anticipating him. By the 4th day, the silence in the woods felt heavy, like the air pressure dropping before a tornado. Isaiah didn't even take the tripod out of the truck. He grabbed his keys and a pry bar and walked straight to the oak tree to get his trail camera. He was done. Reaching the oak, the woods were dead silent. He grabbed the camera and walked fast back to the truck. He locked the doors before he even put the key in the ignition. He plugged the SD card into his laptop right there in the cab. He needed to know he wasn't cracking up. Last video file, 3 a.m., 14 minutes long. He clicked play. Grainy night vision showed the clearing in black and gray. For a few seconds, nothing. Then from the right, the deer entered. But it wasn't walking. Isaiah stopped breathing. On the screen, the massive buck was walking on its hind legs. It didn't hop like a trained circus animal. It walked with a slow, smooth, terrifying balance. Its front legs hung limp at its chest. It moved closer to the tree, silent and deliberate, until its face filled the frame. It lifted its front hooves and pressed them against the bark on either side of the camera, like a man leaning in to look through a window. For 14 minutes, it stared into the lens. It didn't blink, but its mouth, its dark, wet, animal mouth, was moving. It was twitching rapidly, lips shaping air. It looked like it was counting or whispering. Isaiah watched, terrified, as the creature seemed to speak a silent language to the machine. Biology doesn't do that. He ripped the card out. He started the truck, threw it into gear, and spun the tires in the mud. As he turned the wheel, his headlights swept across the clearing one last time. He slammed on the brakes. Around the base of the oak tree, where the camera had been, the ground was different. Isaiah had left bundles of bright orange survey stakes stabbed into the ground in a line. They were gone. No, moved. The stakes had been pulled up and hammered back into the earth in a perfect geometric circle around the tree. They were spaced evenly, with mathematical precision, centered exactly where the thing had stood on its hind legs. Isaiah grabbed his GPS handset. He looked at the map. He looked at 4 days of work, thousands of points of data. Every single point on the map had been changed. They all read the exact same coordinate: latitude, longitude, elevation. Every unique point in the woods had been overwritten with the single location of that oak tree. The data wasn't just corrupted, it was rewritten. He drove until he was 2 counties over. He quit the job over the phone the next day. He told them the equipment was faulty. The timber company sent a new guy, a younger surveyor named Abner, to retrieve the gear. Abner called Isaiah a few days later. He said he found the total station standing upright, perfectly leveled, in a line leading into the deep timber. He said it looked like someone had set it up to survey a path that wasn't on any map. "Weirdest thing, though," Abner said, laughing nervously. "There were tracks next to the gear. Looked like you walked off into the woods with a buddy." Isaiah gripped the phone. "Describe them." "Well," Abner said, "there's heavy boot prints, probably yours. And right next to them, stride for stride, are deer tracks. But deep ones, like the deer was walking on 2 legs right beside you." "Did they come back?" Isaiah asked. "That's the thing," Abner said. "The boot prints stop about 50 yards in, but the deer tracks, they turn around and come back out alone." Isaiah hung up. He works in a warehouse now. Concrete ceilings, artificial lights, places where the angles are square and nothing waits for you in the silence.